Gentlelady from New York.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 163, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-559, offered by Ms. Tenney of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1316, the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tenney, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Chair, I rise to offer my amendment number 163 to the Defense Appropriations Bill to prohibit funding for President Biden's executive order number 14019 entitled Executive Order on Promoting Access to Voting. This executive order requires federal agencies to use their power, influence, and resources and federal funding, taxpayer cash, to enter into agreements with non-governmental organizations, third-party organizations, to conduct voter registration and other voter mobilization activities, including vote harvesting. Mr. Chair, this executive order is nothing but a blatant attempt to transform the federal government into a partisan get-out-the-vote machine for Democrats. The Department of Defense should be completely nonpartisan and should be using taxpayer funds to actively engage, should not be using taxpayer funds to actively engage in get-out-the-vote operations that have nothing to do with the core mission of the Department of Defense, not to mention the obvious mission creep and Hatch Act violations this activity would trigger. Mr. Chair, President Biden should not be weaponizing the federal government spending using American taxpayer dollars to manipulate and steer our election in a partisan manner. As the co-founder and the chair of the Election Integrity Caucus, it is my privilege to introduce this amendment to restore transparency and confidence in our democratic process while keeping partisan federal bureaucrats and the swamp, literally, from deliberately tipping the balance at the ballot box. I stand firmly behind the concept of one citizen, one vote, as enshrined in our Constitution. However, I do not support this blatantly partisan mobilization of the federal government for political purposes, especially at such a critical time in the world. The Department of Defense should be laser focused on the missions at hand and countering our adversaries, such as the Chinese Communist Party, not implementing a partisan get-out-the-vote initiative. With that, Mr. Chair, I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, which will preserve election integrity, stop the Biden administration from transforming the Department of Defense into a get-out-the-vote partisan machine for the Democrats. Let's make voting great again. I reserve.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Minnesota seek information?
Mr. Chair, I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment banning sections of Executive Order 14019. This is another example of the majority proposing language that is not germane to this bill. Mr. Chair, call me a traditionalist, call me a person who respects the roles that different committees have, but this is not germane to this bill. Section 1 of the executive order states, and I quote, "The right to vote is a foundation of American democracy. Free and fair elections that reflect the will of the American people must be protected and defended." And Section 2 states that it is a policy of my administration, referring to the Biden administration, to promote and defend the right to vote for all Americans who are legally entitled to participate in this election. Now, I don't understand the concern of this order, since it had several places directs officials to conform to the laws of the United States. And furthermore, Mr. Chair, as I spoke about germaneness earlier, I don't understand how this amendment was made in order, especially when the Department of Defense bill has in the gentlewoman's amendment exclusions, references to the military. So in the amendment, which the clerk has in front, it exempts sections 7, 8, and I believe it's 10. I'm trying to do it from memory, Mr. Chair, which deals with the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense is totally excluded from anything that the gentlewoman would like to resolve with her amendment. Therefore, it makes it totally non-germane. So for that reason alone, I strongly object to this amendment because of its non-germaneness to this bill. And in the comments that have been made, it's about making sure that the Department of Defense somehow is making sure that they follow the law. The Department of Defense is excluded in this amendment, and so the gentlewoman's reference to the Department of Defense being laser focused on this amendment is very confusing to me, Mr. Chair, when it is excluded and it is non-germane to this bill. With that, I reserve my time.
The lady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With all due respect, our Constitution clearly states the administration of elections is in the province of the states. It is not for the federal government to use federal agencies to coordinate with third-party partisan groups using taxpayer dollars in order to get out the vote for Democrats. Our mission of the Department of Defense is to protect and secure our nation, not to get the vote out. We encourage and want every member of the military who's an eligible citizen to vote in our elections. We do not want them to be in a partisan manner and have our taxpayer dollars used in a partisan way for a vote harvesting scheme conceived by the Democrats and by this executive order. And first of all, this is mission creep. The Department of Defense has to focus on its very serious mission. This is germane. We are using taxpayer dollars, taking military members and people paid under the Department of Defense to work on vote harvesting schemes, not on their mission of protecting the American people. And with that, I encourage all of my colleagues to vote for this amendment and make voting great again and make our free and fair elections once again possible in the United States of America. And with that, I yield.
Gentlelady yields. Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Chair, could I inquire how much time I have left?
Lady has 2.5 minutes remaining.
And Mr. Chair, did I understand correctly that the gentlewoman has yielded back her time, so this would be my time to close?
That's correct.
Thank you. I just want to once again state that especially with the exemptions to the military, that this piece of legislation is not germane to the Defense Appropriations Bill. And we have to stop in this institution putting non-germane issues, especially authorizing issues, into appropriations bills. We each have our roles, and we need to respect them. The gentlewoman's concerned about the Biden administration somehow doing something inappropriate by making sure that every American has the opportunity and the acknowledgement of when and how to vote. Maybe she's concerned, Mr. Chair, because the OSC, which is the Office of Special Counsel, found 13 violations by senior Trump administrators, including 2 violations in connection with the 2020 RNC. Their report outlined how these 13 officials used their authority to influence and interfere or affect the results of the 2022 presidential election. So maybe that's why she's concerned, because she saw abuses in the previous administration. I believe this administration will uphold the law. They restated that they will. And Mr. Chair, once again, this amendment is not germane to this bill, and it is not necessary, but I do share the gentlewoman's concerns that the previous administration violated the law. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.